Hi, I'm Ard Stetts, and we're making a video to explain streamer fishing and how I rig my leaders and my fly lines for streamer fishing. And so we're going to start out, instead of me wading out there into the river and casting right away, I'm going to explain to you how this rig works. And it's probably a little bit different than what you're used to. We have two rods rigged up here. The first one, what I have tied on it just for a demonstration fly, is kind of a mini intruder, kind of food colored fly, and there's no weight to that fly at all. And from the fly, going backwards, got about 3 feet, 2.5 feet of leader. Usually I use 3, but this one's been cut and tied and cut and tied, so you're down to about 2.5 feet. A loop-to-loop connection onto a braided nylon loop. That is fixed onto the end of the sinking head. That is Z9. Z is another material very much like T. Everybody's familiar with that. T11, T14, sink tips. Z is just a different kind. It's zinc impregnated instead of tungsten. And I fix these on a braided loop onto the Z material, and I put a nail knot on them to make sure they don't come off. The reason I do that is because although this material is very weldable and you can make neat little welded loops on it, a monofilament leader hooked into a welded loop will eventually cut the welded loop, whether it's on the end of your floating fly line or whether it's on the end of your sink tip. Eventually that monofilament cuts the welded loop, whether you're snagged on a rock, a stump, or a fish. Someday that welded loop breaks and you lose the rig. Okay, so we've got your 3-footed tippet. My sink tips are only 4 feet long, and I do that for a reason, and we're going to get to that. The 4 foot of sinking material has the braided loop on each end. The braided loop on the back end, going towards your fly line, is another loop-to-loop connection, and that is fixed on to a 6 foot long piece. I'm getting instructions from my videographer here. That loop is fixed onto a 6 foot long piece of 50-pound test monofilament. Originally I started doing this with 25-pound back in 1994, and now I've beefed it up to a 50-pound test butt because this turns big flies over better. And this piece of weighted material, Z9, 4 feet of it, you've got the 36 grains of sink material built right into the middle of your leader. So you need a pretty hefty butt to turn that over nicely for you. So you have your 6 foot of 50-pound test monofilament. Back here, this is where it gets interesting. This braided connector, as we all know, most fly lines today, whether the spay lines or the traditional fly line for a single hand rod, they come with a welded loop on the end, and you're paying for that. When you buy the fly line, you're paying for this welded loop, and everybody seems to run into the same problem. My monofilament leader eventually wears out, cracks, tears, or cuts the welded loop off. And I was faced with this, I think it's been 5-6 seasons ago. I had a king salmon like just break off, and that's what happened. My welded loop got cut, it broke, it was gone. And what I came up with for that is this is a piece of braided monofilament with a loop on both ends. One loop attaches to my vinyl coated fly line, and I assume we're looking at that really close right now, and that line is in perfect condition. I mean, you could sell this as a used line with the welded loop on it, and other than that little kink in the end from my loop-to-loop connection, it's not cut and it's not going to break. That's because I'm using braided monofilament to connect the two. I started making these after that king salmon broke off on me. And they work really well. There's no hinging, there's no BS to it. They just work, and they protect this welded loop, and they give you a really solid connection to your braided mono. I do make these, and if you're interested in getting any of them, just drop me an email. If you're watching this on the North American Fly Fishing Forum, then you can contact me there. Otherwise, you can visit my website and just leave me an email there saying, hey, I'd like some of those loops. And that website is Life on the Line, or you can just Google fishing with Ard, A-R-D, Stetts, and you'll get to the website. And then you can drop an email, and I can mail you some loops. Okay, so this line, and I should discuss this also. I don't use really short heads. This line we're connected to here is kind of a, I can't really call that olive, but it is kind of olive green. It's a 45-foot long Super Scandi. So that is the shortest line that I have rigged up today, a 45-footer. The other rod, I've rigged two rods because the second one has a white line on it. And that is so it's easier to see. We're going to let that fly get wet. The white line is a 65-foot javelin that I got out of the UK, England, and it is rigged exactly the same way. I won't go through the same deal of explaining it all, but this is the same rig. Braided loop connector back here at the fly line, braided loops all the way down, 6 foot of 50-pound test, 4 foot of sinking material in the middle of the leader, 3 foot of tippet on the end. So why do you do that? If you're fishing with a long 45-foot or longer floating fly line, or if you're using a single hand rod, most single hand fly lines, whether they're weight forward or double taper, are a 90-foot fly line, and the whole line is designed to float. So a floating fly line makes for a really good indicator. You can see your line floating, you can control it, you can mend the line, you can do things with that long floating fly line that you can't with a 22 to 26 foot long head. If you're fishing with a let's just say a 26 or 27 foot long head, and on the back end of it you're using a braided running line like a Slick Shooter or whatever they are. I don't even own any. All these lines have an integrated vinyl clad running line built right into the back of them. So I don't have to go loop to loop onto running lines or shooting lines. But if you are fishing a short head like that, then you know that once you chuck that baby out in the river, that light braided running line you have behind it, it doesn't give you a lot of ability to mend that line. There's not much you can do with that head once it lands out there, unless you get into a really high rotating arm movement and trying to move that head with your whole rod, your whole upper body. It's hard to control the line. So with the short head line, once it lands, it is what it is. Your fly's gonna sink, your tip's gonna sink, wherever it's at, that's where it's at. Not a lot of controllability for the angler there. With the longer floating fly lines, you can do a lot as far as slowing down the speed of the drift, the direction that the swing takes in the river. And speaking of the river, we're going to take a look up this. So let's take a look at this river where we're at. What we have here is a pretty classic piece of water. Whether you're fishing for trout or salmon, you've got an area up there where you're feeding into a really, really long run. I'd say the average current speed in here is between 3 and 4 miles an hour. The width of this run is roughly 90 feet to 100 feet. And this is where we're going to do the demo. I hope you're going to be able to see what I'm going to do with this line, because what we're going to talk about is how to control your fly, how to get the depth you want in a typical fishing situation without piling a huge heavy weighted fly onto your line, and without having to use 15 foot or 10 foot of T11 or T14 to try to get it down. Because we all know that when you have that much sink tip on there, it's not really easy to cast again. Whether you're using a single hand rod or a double hand rod, it's hard to get all that sinking material up out of the water. You have to strip in almost the whole fly line, and it's actually kind of hard to get that baby aerialized again and back out there in the water where the fish are at. And that's what this is all about, getting the fly where the fish are at. And we'll continue this in just a moment. All right, now we're going to deal with the sinking leader, the fly, and your mending. Now remember, this is not all about spey rod fishing. It's not all about two-hand casting. All I'm trying to do is help people to understand how to fish a streamer fly better. And there's no guarantees that if you do this, you're going to go out and immediately catch fish. But it will improve your chances, I believe. It will. That's why I'm taking the time to do this, because I've tried to tell people so many times. Now I'm actually going to show you. You'll see that I'm standing over knee deep, and I'm 6'5" tall. So I'm in 2 to 2.5 feet of water. The first thing you need to figure out about whatever fly or line you're fishing is how fast does it really sink. We all know that they say things on the package, but let's find out how fast it really sinks. Best way is you're standing in current. The water clarity here is half decent today, so we're going to just drop this in the water and see how long it takes for that fly to hit the bottom. That's my sinking material and my fly. And we're going to just chuck it in and count. 1001, 1002, 1000, it's down. A little under 3 seconds. And I'm down in 2.5 feet of water. Okay. The water out here where we're going to fish, that's more like 6 feet deep. So you know you can reach 2.5 feet in a few seconds. 2.5 seconds, you're 2.5 feet deep. 10 seconds, you ought to at least be able to get down 5 feet out there in the current. This is another thing you have to consider. Current. We're not fishing in a lake here. Rivers and creeks, they're moving. So when you throw a fly out onto the water, you got the spot where it lands. And the best way I can think of to try to get you to realize what it is that's happening when you're streamer fly fishing is think of a triangle. Out here in the river, you've got the spot where your fly is going to land. Think of that as the top or the peak of a triangle, where it lands. The depth of the water is the bottom of that leg of your triangle, 5 or 6 foot deep. So there's one leg of your triangle. From where the fly lands, straight down to the bottom. 5 feet, let's stick with that. Now you've got the current speed. What is it really over there? And it's different at every section of the water column as you move down. But let's say the average current speed out there is 3.5 miles an hour. Okay, that means as your fly sinks, it's going to be drifting downstream. So you've got one leg from where it lands to the bottom. Now it's drifting downstream. The bottom is actually a leg of your triangle because it's pretty consistent, going straight down the riverbed. As your fly sinks, it's dropping in elevation towards the bottom, and it's creating that third piece of your triangle. And I hope this makes sense. Where the fly lands, to the bottom. Going downstream with the current, the bottom leg. From the top where it landed as it sinks, trying to reach the bottom, your top leg, or the hypotenuse of the triangle. So your desire in fishing a streamer in deeper water, anywhere from 3 feet to 5 feet deep, is you want to get it down there in case the fish aren't hanging around up in the first foot or two of water. So we all know about mending line. You mend a fly line. You throw your fly across the river and you put loops in it, upstream loops. That helps the fly sink. The whole idea of the upstream loop is to give the fly time to sink. Before a belly or a horseshoe-shaped U forms in the line and starts dragging the fly across the river and back up towards the surface. So mending the line is something we all hear about as soon as we get into fly fishing. You got to mend upstream. Upstream mends. Upstream mends. That's the indoctrination to wet fly, nymph, and streamer fishing. Mend the line. What I see people do almost 100% of the time when you're trying to catch trout or salmon here in Alaska, you have to get the fly down. So anglers, they're throwing their fly out there. Whoops. The fly is landing in the river. Then after a couple seconds, they remember, oh, I gotta mend. So they go like this. Yeah, that's kind of a mend, but that whole motion right there, your whole arm and rod tip raising, lifting that whole line off the water and putting it upstream, hang down, I've heard guys call it that, in the line. What that does is it pulls the fly back up. It's sinking right now. Remember, 2.5 seconds to get 2.5 feet deep. So if you throw your fly out there and 2.5 seconds later, remember, oh, I got a mend. What you just did is pulled the fly up at least half of your 2.5 feet that you had already gained in sinking. My simple answer to this is to learn, to train yourself every time you cast a streamer fly. Mend that line now. Just a little simple flip of the wrist, roll of the rod tip, not an arm motion, just a simple, I hope you can see this white line, simple little rotation of the rod, jumps that line up in the air and puts an upstream loop in it for you. And if you can get in the habit of making a cast and mending that line before that fly ever hits the water, you've already got a loop on the back side of the line. Your fly's sinking. You can continue to put loops on the back of that line, and that fly will continue to sink, and you are not impeding that sink rate by pulling on the whole fly line, because you've put a loop on the back side of the line before the fly ever struck the surface. And we're going to do that just a couple more times, and then I'll talk about it more instead of demoing it more. You're making a cast. That loop is on the back end of your head before that fly ever hit the water. Now you can continue to pile line on the back of that loop without interfering with that fly's ability to sink. Once it has reached the level, 10 seconds worth of sink time, it's already down, it's already starting across the river. Now you can put a downstream loop with another small rotation of the rod tip, downstream loops on your line, and allow the current to catch those loops. That will pull that fly across the river while maintaining a little bit of depth. It will rise towards the surface as the tension of the current pulls your line. That fly will rise. But by putting enough loops on the back side of your cast before the fly ever hits the water, and then continuing to keep that tension off of your line while that fly sinks with little bitty movements like that. That's all it takes. Once she's down, a downstream loop. Get that fly to cross the channel. Come right across there as deep as you possibly can and swing right through that current. It'd be a beautiful thing if we'd pick up a fish right here, but it's September 28th. The trout are still pretty far up the river. The salmon are way up there. That's why the trout are up there. So the chances of us hooking one up right here, not real good. But it does make an excellent place to demonstrate this cast. Across the river and a loop in that line before that fly hit the water. That's the most important lesson to learn. And it doesn't take a big lift of the arm and a big lift of the line, because if that happens, you're pulling that fly back up away from the bottom, defeating the purpose of trying to fish deep. We're gonna let her drift down there. There is a fish. Either that or I was down deep enough that we were on the bottom right there. Great demonstration, because this is an unweighted fly on 4 foot of Z9. And we were on the bottom. I don't think that was a fish. across we go. In goes the loop. Fly hit the water, loop was already in. Now we're gonna pile some more on there. With proper mending and only 36 grains of sinking material, you should be able to get an unweighted fly down 4 or 5 foot deep to the point where you're actually getting snagged. And there it goes. We're all the way down. Now I'm making those little downstream loops, and I'm encouraging that fly to follow my rod tip and cross that entire river channel below me. Of course, if we were fishing this actively, we'd be taking a step after every 1 or 2 casts and moving down towards those riffles. But I hope this, with the white line and everything that I've tried to say, there's your loop, and the fly hit the water. Right about time I said the word loop, it was gone down. Now, with very subtle movements, you can continue to mend line, you can pull it out of your reel and stack more on behind it. Let that fly get as deep as it can. Downstream loop, little circle of the rod tip. More downstream loops, and it comes across the channel. The best thing that can happen when you're fishing a streamer fly is that you cast across the channel, your fly sinks as deep as possible while it's dead drifting downstream, and when the tension finally comes on the line, you want that fly to cross that channel broadside. Because if the fish are actually laying in the channel, they're looking upstream. If you can get your fly to cross the river channel broadside to the fish, say you're fishing a featherwing streamer or a leech pattern, they get a good look at the side profile of your lure, and it's crossing right in front of them. A little bit more encouraging for them to either follow, grab, or at least notice it, than if it dead drifts all the way down past them, and then the current gets a hold of it and it does a quick little button hook and rises to the surface. There are times when that's handy, but we're not fishing in those circumstances right now. We're talking about general fishing conditions where you want to mend your line early in the cast. Don't make mending, when you're streamer fishing, don't make mending the fly line an afterthought. Have it in your mind when if you're single hand casting, and let's get some line in here so I can do it with this big old rod. If you're single hand casting, put it in there now, before that fly hits the water. If you're just doing a typical fly cast with a one-handed rod, when that fly is headed towards the water, put that mend in your line so that you can start aiding and assisting that fly to sink as deeply as it can. Then when you're ready for it to cross the current, little downstream flip, and start guiding it across with your rod tip. And it will get your flies down better. And as I said when we first got started here, the reason I rigged these leaders this way is because it allows me to move that fly line all over the river. And with a 65-foot head, belly, line, whatever we're going to call it, I've got a lot of floating line out there. If we're fishing in an area strewn with boulders, like some of the rivers I fish here, you are able to move this fly actually behind things, in front of things, just by changing where the floating line is. The fly is going to follow that line. Wherever that floating line's at, whatever the floating line's doing, your fly will eventually mimic that motion. And that's another video talking about how to know what your fly is really doing. We won't show you right now, but I'll talk about it very briefly. Now, I can't do anything briefly. So here's something you can all do to really help yourself. If everybody's heard, hey, you want to catch big fish, use streamer flies. That's true. I lived in Pennsylvania for a large part of my life. Fished the very famous spring creeks back there. There were big brown trout there, and if you wanted to catch them, yeah, there was always somebody talking about they caught one on a size 20 nymph or something. But if you wanted to catch them consistently, you did it with streamer flies. And you did it by controlling the fly, getting it deep, and appealing to the fish with a larger fly. But the question is, what's your fly really doing? While you're doing all this mending and rod tip movements and so forth, what's your fly doing? Find yourself an area where you've got water, like I'm standing in, 2-3 feet of depth, good clear water. Tie a fly onto your line, onto the end of a leader, say a 9-foot leader, 10-foot leader. Tie a fly on there that's going to be really easy to see. Blaze orange, pure white marabou, something like that, something you will really be able to see out there in the river. Throw your fly into the water. Don't cast 70 or 80 feet away. Just cast your fly out there about 30 feet or so you can see it. Then start making your upstream mends. Make them late, like I've been preaching against. Make those mends late and watch what happens to your fly. See your fly rise back towards the surface. Make them early and stack the mends on the back of your fly line. See how your fly won't react to your mending by climbing towards the surface. Make downstream loops in your fly line. Little twitch on the rod tip. Guide the rod tip towards shore. Watch the fly. Learn by observing the fly what it does in relationship to your mending, whether they be upstream or downstream loops, twitching of the rod tip, raising the rod tip, following the fly with the rod tip, or holding it stationary to speed the swing up. Watch that fly. This whole process I'm talking about, you can accomplish this in 15 minutes. 15 minutes out of a beautiful day out on the river with good, clear water conditions, and learn what that fly is doing out there. Imprint that in your mind, remember it, because that'll happen with every fly in every river, regardless of whether it has a little weight on it, or it's on a sink tip, or you're dry line fishing it for steelhead. That fly will do the same thing in response to your mending, twitching, or the position of your rod tip to control speed. A rod tip stopped straight across the river will encourage a faster swing. A rod tip following the drift, slower and more sinking. And once you see that, and I haven't spoke to another fisherman yet who really has done that, just went out, picked a day, forgot about catching fish, threw flies in the water and studied what they did. Because it'll happen regardless of if the water can be muddy. You may not be able to see your fly, but believe me, it'll do the same thing in muddy water as it did that clear water day when you were studying it. And that lesson right there is going to be really helpful, because it takes a lot of that guesswork out of streamer fishing. Because if you have made that visual connection between what happens when I mend upstream, what happens when I put a downstream loop in, what happens when I'm stack mending on the back of my cast, what happens when I stop the rod tip and speed the swing up, or follow the drift with my rod tip, and you actually see the fly respond to those actions that you are making, the action you're taking with your rod and your line, you'll remember it. And you'll know when you're fishing in an area like this and you can't see your fly out there because it is 60 or 70 feet away and it is 5 feet deep, you'll know what it's doing anyhow. And whether or not that means you catch more fish than anybody else or not, what it does for me personally, it's a great reward at the end of the day, whether I caught a lot of fish or whether I only caught one fish. At least I understood what was happening out there. And if I go with no fish, I don't go home feeling bad, because I know I did the best I could do. I know that I understood what was happening out there while I was manipulating my rod, my line, my fly, trying to make it do everything I could that has worked in the past. And we all know on any given day, you may go fishless. But at least if you're following the same process, the same practices that you have developed over time by observing and learning, your chances of success will be improved. And I'm not going to keep preaching and insisting that you do things my way, but it may help you. So I hope that in all this video footage we're going to put together, I do get a couple messages across. The early mending, understanding the trajectory that your fly takes from where it landed until it reaches its terminal depth. And you encourage it to begin the swing. We've all heard about the swing. But the swing, you can have a lot of control over that. Or you can have virtually none. It's up to you. All you have to do is, I guess, what I just have been talking about. Watch your fly on a clear water day. Learn what it does. Apply it every time you go streamer fishing, and you just might have some better results. And I guess I'm done.